And
I
that's
know.
and that's quite a great background behind you, Mark. That's gorgeous. Is that your house?
I wish.
Yeah.
No, actually had dinner in this very room
Wow.
just a few nights ago. This is Quarry Farm, where Mark Twain used to spend his summers. It is now the
Wow.
Center for Mark Twain Studies,
That's great.
and we're in residence here for a week. I know isn't this this is
Mm,
the library? Isn't this amazing?
That's
mm.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just got a first edition of Connecticut Yankee in the mail today. So I collect first edition Twain in my spare time. So great. So we are here gathered. So yeah, what's the drill? How would you like to proceed?
Who's moderating?
I don't know. Uh, what's the panel?
I wrote this book for three reasons. One, again, because I needed to, like my dad, I find writing cathartic.
Yes.
And I wanted to know more about my dad's professional life. And I wanted to, I'd heard some fallacious things said about my father, that he was this dark, tortured soul. And I wanted to set the record straight because that was the polar opposite of who my father was.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I wrote the book, and just grateful to you and to Mark and Arlen and others who are so passionate about my father and promoting his legacy and remembering him. It's
You
would have
know,
been stunning to my dad, and he'd be grateful as.
yeah, and I think, and also, by the way, Reba just sent in a text saying that she just needs to be re-elevated as a speaker, that she's back. So I don't know who has that capability, but if someone at Monsterama does, please do, because obviously we want Reba. There, I see her name. So hopefully, let's see if we can. There you are, Reba. So how are you doing? Can you hear us? Can you see us?
Yes, I can.
Good, 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 good. So why don't you introduce yourself as well, and why you're on this panel and all of that?
Yeah, so I am trying to get everything reoriented. I am Reba Wisner. I am an assistant professor of music history at Columbus State University,
Right.
and I am the author of A Dimension of Sound: Music in the Twilight Zone.
Great, terrific, and I think we all might want to touch on what Anne was just talking about, where that common misconception that was fueled by some of the early biographies of your dad that were kind of, I don't think they were trying to be hatchet jobs, but I think they were looking for a hook, a narrative hook, and it was like, oh well, he started out as the golden boy of television, and by the end he didn't know if he had succeeded at anything, and what a tragic figure. The problem, I think, was that your dad, Anne, tended to be his own harshest critic. And so, you catch him on a day when he's struggling with a script and it's not going well, and you say, well, what do you think of yourself as a writer? He's going to say, well, I tried my best, but I think these biographies and the authors of those biographies really misrepresented your dad, because I was very lucky. I started work on the Twilight Zone companion 2 years after Rod's sad and untimely death. I mean, it was sad to the degree that he was only 50. I mean, my gosh, and and everything was still in place. The house was exactly as he left it. His office was as he left it. All the science fiction paperbacks were still there, and I was able to come upon video recordings, black and white video recordings of him teaching at Sherwood Oaks College, among other places. And these were not for broadcast. And so as a result, he was totally candid. This was around 1972, and he was such a warm and such a funny and such a present person. So I mean, the lack of arrogance and egotism. I mean, he would just talk to the students with such warmth and openness and really listen. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, Anne, but I think it would be worth discussing.
Yeah, he was very self-deprecating, and that speaks to what you were just saying. But again, the polar opposite of what these other biographers described him as. He was, and I've said this, brilliantly funny and silly, and
Yes.
a prankster. And my friends would meet him, and they might, if they were wary at first, because here's the Twilight Zone guy, immediately they would sense his warmth, his interest in them. he would ask, about, what they were interested in and what their parents did. There were always three questions. Was your dad in the war? What do your parents do? And how old are they? So, but just so funny and warm and just greatly missed.
Yes,
Greatly
yes.
missed. That's the kind of loss that, it's really difficult. Well, anyone would say that, I think, about someone they love. I'm not unique in that by any means, but
Yes, but I remember when I was at the Clarion Writers Workshop. I was 19 years old when the news came over over the press that Rod had passed, and I just felt that tremendous loss too. I think the nation and the world did. I mean, because he was the host of the show, because certain people project an authenticity, and your dad certainly did. And I think all of us who watched Twilight Zone or Night Gallery or saw him on a talk show had a feeling like, gosh, I'd like to know that guy. He seems so wonderful in every way. I think there was authenticity in his work and in his public persona. And I know that I felt a terrible loss when he'd gone, and I've often said that had he not died, I wouldn't have written the Twilight Zone Companion, because if anyone should have written a book about the making of the Twilight Zone, it should have been your dad, But then I realized, well, there's no one who's stepping up to do it, and I was very, very interested in the subject, of course, and so I jumped in at 21 years old to pull off this amazing, impossible feat. But off of what you were saying, when I interviewed Burgess Meredith, he said about your dad, he said, like most good writers, he listened more than he talked. And I thought that was very, very wise. So Mark, you've everything you've known, you've learned from the Twilight Zone. So you're a wise man indeed. So what drew you to the Twilight Zone? Why write about the Twilight Zone?
Well, it's been my favorite show since childhood. But I have to say, and I've told the tale till it's gone stale, but I've never had a chance to tell it with you on the panel, Mark. Which is, and you may know this. I may have even told you this. I may tell it to you again the next time we talk. But the reason I wrote the book I did was because you wrote the book you did. I was finishing up my first book Anne knows this story. I was finishing up my first book, which was a slice of theater history, in 1981. It was published in 1982. It was a history of the Barter Theater, in very colorful theater in Virginia. And everybody was saying, well, what's your next book going to be? I said, my next book's going to be a history of the Twilight Zone. Why not me? Why shouldn't I write that book? And never stopping to think, and I was living and working in East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia at the time. And maybe that's not the best place to write a history of the Twilight Zone, And but I did enough to fool myself into thinking, I'm going to be the guy to write this book. Donna Douglas came to town to shoot a commercial for RVs. And I ran down to the set, and she was dressed as Ellie Mae Clampett. And I interviewed her about, you were on the Twilight Zone. What a great Twilight Zone episode. The bandages. Yeah. Okay. And then a couple of the people who got their start at the Barter Theater, Claude Akins and Fritz Weaver, were both in. And so I'm kind of fooling myself that I'm going to be this. But then I walk into a bookstore in 1982, and you know what I saw. There it was. And I couldn't even be angry about it, because you did such a good job with that book that I couldn't even get pissed off about it. I took the book home, and I immediately set my sights on another favorite TV show, which was Columbo. And I wrote the history of the Columbo file, and that was published in 1989. And that whole time, my idea was to write as good a book on Columbo as you had done on the Twilight Zone.
Oh, well,
that
thank
was my
you.
bar.
Wow.
Because I thought that was the best book written on the history of a TV show. It really set the standard.
Thank you. It was interesting because it took 2 years to sell and was rejected by 25 publishers. Because at that time, they would say, well, why would anyone want to read about a book about a TV show that's gone off network, that's no longer airing new episodes? And it was obvious to me, of course, and to all of us who were on this panel, certainly. But because The Twilight Zone came out and was a huge bestseller, it sold over 500,000 copies. That basically started the genre of books about television series. There had been a couple before, but very few, and I was very proud of that. And It's funny. I just did a new edition of the Twilight Zone companion that just came out that has 100 more pages and 500 new photographs and links to audio and video. Because when I wrote the book, if you wanted to watch any of these rarities like the time element or any of that stuff, you had to go to a university archive and put it on a 16 millimeter print on a moviola. And, you know, and now, of course, YouTube has everything. And so I wanted to provide the fans with a lot of the cool things that I got to see when I was writing the book. And of course, people kept telling me stories about Twilight Zone after I finished the book. So that was the reason I wanted to include it. But I think the fact that, you know, as you said, Anne, it all starts with Rod. I mean, without Rod, there is no Twilight Zone, and other people worked on it and did brilliant work, certainly. But he was the magic. He was the genius, and all I can say is thank God for censorship, or he wouldn't have written Twilight Zone, because he would have been able to say what he wanted to say on mainstream television. But so Reba, you've written about the music on Twilight Zone, correct?
Yes.
And I personally believe that Twilight Zone has the greatest music of any television show ever. I mean, my God, Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith and all those, Franz Waxman, for God's sake. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how you got into this, or what you think of the music of Twilight Zone and how it elevates the show.
So for me, I remember the very first episode I saw. I was about 6 years old. It was 5 characters in search of an exit, which is probably the most horrifying episode for a 6-year-old to be watching. But I fell in love with the show. And at that point, I lived in New York City. We had WPIX, which would run the reruns all the time. So I got to see a lot of the episodes, and my parents would turn it on, which is why the dedication to my book is, you know, to my parents who turned on the Twilight Zone and unknowingly created a monster, because they really did. And so in reading your book, in reading Martin Graham's book, there was mention of the music, but really not too much. And at the time where I conceived of writing the book, I was writing my doctoral dissertation on something completely different. I was working on 17th century Venetian opera. I could not stand to look at it anymore. And so I said, well, let me take a look at the music, because the music actually really is a powerful aspect of the series.
Yes.
And I was able to get copies of the manuscript scores. I was able to get in touch with Robert Drasnin, who has since passed away, who is one of the composers on the series. Tommy Morgan, who I believe also recently passed away. He wrote the preface to my book, which I am incredibly indebted to. But I think there was a lot of things going into the music of the Twilight Zone, not the least of which, as you said, Mark, you know, they have people who are writing for like the golden age of television and the golden age of radio. Yeah. And a lot of that radio music was reused in the series. And
like on The Hitchhiker.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, even now, just listening, I've been on a old Westerns kick, and every time I watch an episode of Have Gun Will Travel, like I'll hear Twilight Zone music in there. Of course, it was originally in Have Gun Will Travel.
Yeah.
But my brain just takes it to exactly the spot, or one of the spots when it was reused in multiple places, that I hear in the Twilight Zone, which is both a blessing and a curse. But the idea that, you know, these really big names in music composition for film and television were employed to write unique scores for the series is in itself amazing. Let alone the magnificent work that actually came out of it.
Yes, I agree. And it's I mean, it's really because Rod invited people to come in and do their most brilliant work. You know, Charles Beaumont told the story about when he was invited to write for Twilight Zone. He'd already been writing for Westerns, Wanted Dead or Alive, all sorts of stuff. And he was used to his work being eviscerated. And Rod said, no, you write it the way you want to write it, and that's what we'll make. And he didn't believe it, but he said, well, I'll just take a flyer anyway. And he was amazed that Rod shot the script as written. And that was the same with Matheson, the same with George Clayton Johnson, and so forth. Rod respected the writers. And I don't know if you want to talk about that aspect, about how collaborative your dad was in this show. I mean, please.
Well, I've heard they were a seamless team.
Yes.
And that it was a happy place. And that doesn't always happen, right? But I think there was deep respect for each other, and it shows.
Yes, and I think that, and it was in every department. It was like Buck Houghton was such a perfect match for Rod as the line producer, as the producer who would bring the nuts and bolts production elements to it. And then you bring in phenomenal directors like Doug Hayes and, you know, all of them, Buzz Kulick, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the composers and those phenomenal actors that are both from the golden age of film, like Ida Lupino and Brian Ahern. And then the ones who are up and coming, who will become movie stars like Lee Marvin and Robert Redford and so forth, the young Hollywood. It was just a perfect timing. And as you were saying, Reba, with Bernard Herrmann and Franz Waxman, some of these great composers of the golden age, but then you have a young Jerry Goldsmith coming in, who's going to become one of the great composers of film, moving on with Planet of the Apes and Alien and on, you name it, Star Trek, the motion picture, and Chinatown. So, you know, and one thing I wanted to mention also that we haven't touched on yet is, and I'm very gratified that you guys read my book and it helped, you know, helped you with what you were doing. And of course, you and I have had this friendship going back 40 years now, amazingly. And I'm so honored that you and your mom and your sister allowed me into your world. You know, it was invaluable. I wouldn't have written the book if you guys hadn't been open to that at all. But my goal, in addition to being a huge fan of Twilight Zone, was I wanted to learn how to make, you know, high quality television. I wanted to learn from the best show ever made how to do that. And the fun part, and then I've gone on to write and sell hundreds of scripts, and now I have my own studio. But I know a lot of the top showrunners now, and Rod is their model, their icon. They recognize him as the first great showrunner, the writer who created and ran the show. And this is true of Damon Lindelof, and you name it, David Chase of The Sopranos, and the creators of, you know, Mad Men, and almost any TV show, any drama show, certainly any science fiction show. Rod is the you know, he's the inspiration. So I don't know if you've encountered that, Anne, in your travels, but I certainly have.
Yes. And the other thing that's always fascinated me and moved me is the number of people who have told me that either they became writers because of my dad,
Yes.
or that they felt like he was their father. So many people have told me they had tumultuous childhoods or difficult childhoods, and how watching the Twilight Zone or listening to my father really helped them. And it's pretty surreal to hear that, and I can imagine my father hearing that and how touched he'd be.
Yes.
As I was.
Yes, I mean, he really remade television. He remade the medium, and it was that strange thing. I think everyone who watched Twilight Zone almost felt like he was part of the family. You know, there was such a great connection. This is back in a time when you only had 3 networks, and so everyone watched everything basically one way or another. So whereas now you need a show like Game of Thrones or something like that to have that same kind of impact. You know, whereas, you know, Twilight Zone was getting 30, 40 million people watching it per week, and so that's really phenomenal. But for you, of course, you were you know, a kid when Twilight Zone was in production, and I know that your family initially didn't let you watch Twilight Zone when you were a kid. If you want to talk about how you first saw your episode.
Yeah, it wasn't just Twilight Zone. We weren't supposed. My mother's rule: we weren't supposed to watch TV during the week at all. So it wasn't just Twilight Zone. But my dad and I would sneak episodes of the Flintstones. So we were great fans of that show. But the first Twilight Zone I saw, and I wrote about this in the book, was Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which obviously you all know my dad didn't write. But I was watching it with my father and absolutely terrified that he was connected to this kind of show. Because again, this is the polar opposite of the man I knew.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes, but and again, that one was directed by Richard Donner, who went on to do Lethal Weapon and Superman and all these great movies. I mean, but yes, exactly. I think to any kid who saw pretty much any episode of Twilight Zone, it would knock you back. You know, there was such a power to that show, and because it had those twist endings. I mean, episodes like It's a Good Life, things like that, or even Eye of the Beholder, which you mentioned earlier, Reba. I mean, or I guess Mark, one of you mentioned it, but just phenomenal stuff. And I think one of the surprises that I've had, and I don't know if you had that same surprise too, Anne, a good surprise, was when I wrote the Twilight Zone Companion. You know, we're talking 1977 when I started it, and as you said, 1982 when it came out. I didn't know if Twilight Zone would continue to be popular, would continue to last. And I'm not surprised qualitatively, but I'm very, very, very glad that Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone are as popular now, if not more so, than they were back then.
Right, because, and I'm not obviously the first person to say this, but, they were messages that still people can relate to. It's moral messages, and people don't change. And here we are, and still dealing with racism and, prejudice and all of the things that my dad wrote about, scapegoating,
Yes.
relation, everything. So
I know. Well, Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is every bit as relevant now, if not more so, with, as you were saying, with all the scapegoating and all of the things that are going on the streets. And so, I think there's an irony to the fact that if Rod had not been censored, he would have been writing more about mainstream. He would have been writing mainstream drama about the day, that current period of the 50s, and it would not be as relevant now. The fact that he was forced into science fiction and fantasy and horror made him write more universally, and that proved a great gift to all of us, I think.
And Mark DeWitziak, Lessons from the Twilight Zone, right?
Yes, yes.
Well,
So
and that's kind of the premise of that's kind of how I found my book. How I found after all those years of thinking, well, the Twilight Zone has been written about from every aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Martin Grams did the deep dive into every aspect that you could possibly do. Arlen Schumer did his view on it, and then Reba's done music. Every aspect of the Twilight Zone was kind of done, I thought, and done very well. And then I started sharing the show with my daughter when she turned 15, and she'd seen a lot of classic television up to that point. And actually, she'd seen all of the Night Gallery before. And she liked Night Gallery. But when she turned 15, I said, your undergraduate degree in classic television is accomplished. It's time for you your postgraduate work, and it's time for you to enter the Twilight Zone. So at 15, we did a forced march through all 156 episodes.
Wow. And
we started this running joke where after each episode, I would wag my finger at her jokingly and say, let that be a lesson to you. And whatever it was, and we hit the one with David Wayne as the hypochondriac, as Walter Bedecker, and we got to the end of that, and I said, "Let that be a lesson to you," and we both laughed. And I thought, no, I started to think about people signing contracts, not knowing what was in them, and the financial crisis. And I turned back to Becky and said, I mean this. And it was at that point that the penny dropped and said, "This is your book, stupid." 35 years later, you're going to get your Twilight Zone book. Yeah. These are all life lessons. Every one of these episodes has and this is why the Twilight Zone is still with us. And this is why it's so much alive, it's like you said, Mark, Rod had to hide the message. And I compare him in the book to Mark Twain, of all people. Here I sit in where Mark Twain spent his summers and did all of his writing, right? Yeah. And Mark Twain was once sent a letter by a little French girl named Helene Picard towards the end of his life. And she wrote to him, behind all of the humor and the joking, I sense you're actually a very serious man and you're trying to teach us something. And Twain wrote back a letter to this amazing little girl and said, basically, shh, you've got it. You've got it, but don't tell anybody. I'm a moralist in disguise. Wow. Now, is there a better description of Rod Serling than being forced to be a moralist in disguise when he enters the Twilight Zone and he starts to frame these amazing messages? And they're not just messages for that day. These are messages for us today, and these are messages that are going to be just as good when we're sending ships out to Alpha Centauri and aliens are dropping by with cookbooks here. These messages are going to be just as relevant, and that's why we're talking on this panel right now.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that I talk about often, particularly to the young people that I mentor. That if you ask people what most TV shows are about, the answer is, well, they're about an hour, because they're not about anything, and you don't want to be sanctimonious, you don't want to preach, but you do want to have a moral point of view. And Rod's moral point of view was extremely compassionate, extremely humane. and human. And that comes across. And every now and then he'd find a story that is like, it was such a good story. It's like, okay, you know, poor Burgess Meredith is in the, you know, wandering without his glasses, and, you know, he's screwed. And, you know, it's like, that's such a great story after the bomb. But generally, in most of the episodes, I, the Beholder, is a great example, with this woman saying, can't I just be among people? Can't I just, I'm human. It does, you know, and that's such a plea for anyone who's on the outside looking in. And, you know, and that came from Rod's great core of, he had such a great heart. And wouldn't you agree, Anne? I mean, he was just an amazing man, a great soul, I would say.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wish you all had known him personally. But in a way you do, right?
Yes, yes. And again, I'm so glad you wrote your book, because you showed us another side of your dad that was that wasn't a surprise, because we knew Rod was a lovable, wonderful person, but it was so lovely to see his relationship with you. And you know, and I loved the little things of your relationship that worked their way into the Twilight Zone, like who's your best buddy, you know, that in Praise of Pip, which is again one of his great scripts. And you know, it's you know, all of these little things that just brought a light in a different way. I thought it was a great piece of work. And you know, and again, I'm so glad, I'm so grateful that when I wrote the Twilight Zone companion, with the exception of your dad and Charles Beaumont and one of the writer-directors, Montgomery Pittman, everyone else was still with us, and I could interview them. Now most of them are gone, Matheson and George Clayton Johnson, et cetera, et cetera. They're not with us anymore. And so the fact that I was able to get 100 hours of recordings of these amazing, brilliant people was just...
And at 21 years old, right?
Yes. Well, I once asked George, because George and I were great friends, George Clayton Johnson, who wrote Nothing in the Dark and Kick the Can. And I said to him, because he was the beginning of it, I met him when I was 16. And when I got the idea of writing a book on the Twilight Zone, I did 30 interviews before I ever approached Carol, your mom, because I knew that I was my degree was in painting, sculpture, and graphic arts. I'd never even taken a journalism class. So I knew if I went directly to Carol, she'd say no. And I wouldn't write it without her permission, as I said. So I interviewed 30 people before I approached Carol. And if it was going to be 3 months of wasted effort, so be it. I was willing to put in that time and effort. But George was the first person I interviewed. Then he connected me up with Buck Houghton and Jerry Soule, who people didn't know that he'd ghostwritten for Beaumont on, you know, when Beaumont fell ill on Twilight Zone. But then by the time I got to your mom, I knew so much about the subject, and I felt so confident that I could pull it off. You know, so at one point I said to George Clayton Johnson, years later, I said, what made you think I could pull this off? Because as you said, I was, you know, just out of short pants. And you know, and he said, you just seemed like you really meant you were going to do it. You really, I believed you could pull it off, and you were just very intelligent and very committed to what you were doing. And it's like, good. And but again, that speaks to Rod's influence on me, because Rod, it was so interesting when I started researching how determined he was to get Twilight Zone on the air. He wrote pilot after pilot after pilot until finally he wrote one that actually didn't have much of a fantasy element, hardly at all, where the guy wakes up and he's in an isolation booth. He's an astronaut trainee, and that sold the show. But he wrote Happy Place and other scripts to try to sell Twilight Zone time element before it ever sold. And he was just a man committed to finding some way he could say what he had to say. His message was a very important one. So I don't know.
It's interesting that he wasn't planning to be a writer. He wanted to teach phys ed to kids.
Yeah.
But as he said, the war changed all of that.
Yes.
You know, he was so, like so many, so traumatized by the war.
Yes.
He said he had to get it off his chest. He had to write it out. And I remember him having nightmares when I was a kid and hearing him. And the next morning I would ask him, you know, what happened, and he would tell me he was dreaming that the enemy was coming. So, you know, and again, not unique in that, because God, these young kids that go off to war, it's
Well, it's funny. I wrote a book about my mom during World War II, and I referred to the soldiers as young old men, because they were, you know, they were put through so much that they couldn't really be young anymore, other than by the date on the calendar. And certainly Rod turned to writing for catharsis, as we've all noted in our works, and thank God for that. So so Reba, getting back to you. So So if you were going to recommend a Twilight Zone that you think just where the music is just spectacular, and if you're going to, if you were talking to someone who'd never seen Twilight Zone and you wanted to show them what a musical score on a TV show can do, what would you recommend?
Oh, hands down, Midnight Sun. Nathan Van Cleve's scores are my absolute favorite for the series. Midnight Sun is my top favorite because he just does so much with so little. He really plays on the idea of being stuck and being in this kind of like, you're in this situation where you can't get out of it. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper. You get closer and closer to the sun. And, and you know, that moment always gets me where Norma is looking at the thermometer and it's the mercury is coming out and explodes, and just the music keeps getting faster and faster and faster. And all of a sudden, like, there it is, you're done. And then you see the windowsill with snow, and it's just an incredible thing. And I think that's something that happens a lot in the Twilight Zone scores, where the composers are very, very cognizant that they need to add to the picture rather than detract from it. They need to make sure that what they're writing goes well with the picture. And if it doesn't go well with the picture, there's got to be some reason why it's not going well. And you'll usually find that out at the end. Good example, The Invaders. You know, you'll find out at the end. And Jerry Goldsmith said that he didn't want to give it away with music. So he was very careful with how he did it.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because, you know, you mentioned Van Cleve, and of course he's not as well known as some of these other composers, but certainly is equal in terms of talent. And now also one thing that was interesting with a lot of these composers who at the same time were composing for features, like Bernard Herrmann, they were working with a much smaller ensemble of musicians in their TV work. So I don't know if you want to talk about that or comment on that, but they didn't have 200 musicians at a crack.
Right, exactly. They had very small ensembles. As far as I can remember, I think the largest ensemble in any episode was about 15 or 20 instruments. So they were working with a combination of small budgets, but also who was available. For some instruments, like for instance, if you needed a harmonica, the person you would call would be Tommy Morgan. And if Tommy Morgan was off recording something else, then you would have to either wait or rewrite it so it wouldn't have a harmonica in it. So they were limited by budgets and by availability. But also they were limited by aesthetics too. You know, so some of the episodes really, for instance, the 16mm Shrine, that is one episode that I love to talk about being a very deliberate set of choices, because 16mm Shrine is basically a small truncated version of Sunset Boulevard. And Franz Waxman wrote the score for Sunset Boulevard, so it kind of makes sense that he would also write it for that episode. And a lot of the same instrumentation is there, so he wanted to really maintain that aesthetics for it.
That's cool. And also, sometimes you'll see the composers trying out things that they'll later utilize more broadly in theatrical releases. So, for instance, some of Bernard Herrmann's work on Twilight Zone, when he then later did Fahrenheit 451 in 1967, he's using some similar things that hadn't occurred before in his theatrical scores, but had certainly occurred on Twilight Zone. So, interesting.
Absolutely. And you know, some composers also kind of found their voice in some cases. For instance, Leonard Rosenman wrote a film score for a film called The Savage Eye. And when you listen to it, it's very much sonically like When the Sky Was Open. It's like almost a mirror image. It's really incredible. So they find what works, and then they wind up reusing it. It's almost like a laboratory.
And one thing we can't go without saying or mentioning, of course, is, you know, the first season, Bernard Herrmann did the initial theme music for Twilight Zone, but the theme that everyone remembers is the staccato one, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that one. And if you want to talk a little bit about that and its genesis and who did it.
So what's really interesting about that particular theme is that we don't actually have a concrete answer as to how it came to be. There's about 3 different answers. So the composer of that theme is Marius Constant. And so we have 3 stories. 2 of them are from Constant himself, and 1 is not. The story that usually we get is that there was some sort of a contest for a new theme for the series, and he submitted thinking he wasn't going to win, and then he found out that he won because some American tourists were in France and said, hey, you're that guy who wrote that theme. And he's like, what are you talking about? So that's one story. A modified story of that is he submitted to this contest and he won. He found out he won when he got a $700 check in the mail as a prize. And then the other story, which is probably the more likely story,
Yes.
is that his cues were in the CBS Music Library at least since 1951 or so.
Okay.
And the theme for the Twilight Zone is actually a conglomeration of two of his cues
Yes.
that were probably in the library and spliced together. Unfortunately, the powers that be are no longer alive. I was in touch with Constant's son. He doesn't have any documentation about the theme at all.
Yes.
So, you know, I'm working my best guess. I'm thinking that that last scenario is the right scenario, but
Yeah.
I'm still working on it.
Yeah, and again, Lud Gluskin was in charge of that whole music library at CBS. And at one point, he flew to Europe to re-record the Twilight Zone scores with European musicians, so they wouldn't have to pay royalties, you know, residuals to the American musicians. So again, I'm sure he was very deeply entrenched in the CBS Music Library and finding any trick he could to lower the budget on the shows he was overseeing. And so that's, yeah, so that makes very much that third story, you know. So, but thanks for. But I love the all of us who write books, and you too, Anne. I'm sure you're almost like archaeologists digging through the past and finding all of this magic, and finding the connective tissue, which is always such a fascinating thing. And certainly, Anne, I really recognize the challenge of writing the book that you wrote about your dad. It is so hard to turn a light on one's own life and one's relationships with the people that you love most. And so I know it took you a long time to write that book, and it was not an easy task. I think you succeeded amazingly and wonderfully.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So yeah,
Part
but
of
if you
the
want
most difficult part of writing the book was reading my dad's letters that he wrote to his parents before he went off to war when he was in training camp. And because my son was 18 at the time, so, you know, near the same age my father was. And, you know, it punctuated how young my father was when he went off. And he was writing letters like, and I said this in the book, like he was in summer camp, you know, please send me hangers and chocolate and gum, and then, you know, to then be launched into this horror. It saddened me so deeply, because this, of course, is not a part of my father that I knew growing up.
Yes.
But it was a real exposure, I guess, to that, and a real, then an understanding of, in more depth, of who he was.
Yes, and I really think the war deepened him in a way that was vital to Twilight Zone. I personally think that the Purple Testament is one of the greatest pieces ever written about war in any medium. I think it's phenomenal, and really conveys. I mean, you know that the guy who wrote that script lived that life. It's obvious, and it's not just some guy who watched war movies and extrapolated. And you know, I think you know, and getting back to you, Mark, I think the moral issues that the Twilight Zone explores. I very strongly believe that we as writer, producers, and television and directors have an obligation to our audience to convey a moral viewpoint, and not just say, well, because there was that period when the anti-heroes were in charge, and some of those shows were great, but the message seemed to be, well, life is terrible, nothing's ever going to work out, and you have to be the meanest guy on the planet to survive and win, and the most beastly people win. And I think that was doing a disservice to the audience, because again, shows like Twilight Zone, shows like the original Star Trek, had a moral compass, and I think this went on to inspire people and really inform their lives in a way that was extremely positive and extremely important. You know, some people even hypothesize that the anti-war movement and the hippies and all of those were kids who grew up watching the Twilight Zone. You know, the latter part of the 60s was due to what those kids were watching in the early part of the 60s and late 50s, and I think there's an argument to be made for that. So I don't know if you want to talk a little more about the moral lessons of the Twilight Zone, Mark, but please, you've got the floor.
Sure. No, it couldn't have hurt if they were watching the Twilight Zone. But one thing that I have noticed, because I just wrapped up a 43-year journalism career in April, and 40 of those years were spent as a television critic. So most of that time I was, not only observing the medium but talking. And something that you said, Mark, is absolutely true. The argument could be made, and it's not really an argument because I think it's verifiably true, that Rod Serling is the single most influential writer producer in the history of the medium.
Yes.
That if you ask anybody on whether it's David Chase on The Sopranos or it's Vince Gilligan and Mad Men or whoever it is, or Matt Weiner on Mad Men, I said Mad Men before, Vincent Gill is Breaking Bad.
Yes.
All of sort of the great dramas of the last 20 years.
Yeah.
If you asked any of them, who is your hero? Who is the person who inspired you to do what you do?
Yeah.
They would say Rod Serling. Now, the influence on genre writing is obvious because right away, Gene Roddenberry takes the baton.
Yes.
It's like Twilight Zone goes off the air in 64, Star Trek starts in 66, and Roddenberry says, he showed me how to do it.
Yes.
That if I put this in the context of science fiction, I can talk about anything I want. I can talk about war. I can talk about prejudice. I can talk about anything. I put it on a spaceship and send it out to the stars. Nobody's going to raise an eyebrow. The censor's not going to bother me. The stations in certain parts of the country aren't going to bother me. The standards and practices people aren't going to bother me. And Rod was right. And Gene was right.
Yes.
And then it becomes rolling thunder right on through the succeeding decades. And so, yes, the Twilight Zone has a tremendous impact on genre storytelling and genre shows of all kind. But it has a tremendous impact on all quality television going forward. And Rod Serling and another fellow, Carl Reiner, who greatly admired Gene Roddenberry, actually does an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, which is a Twilight Zone homage.
Yes, it's great. Great episode.
Carl Reiner and Rod Serling are sort of the role model of the writer-producer, the people whose vision controls the show and models the show. And today we have what we call the hyphenates, the writer-producers, the people who take total control of the vision of the show.
Yeah.
That model starts really with Rod Serling and to a certain extent also Carl Reiner. Carl's working it from the comedy side of the street and Rod's working it, and they have a viewpoint.
Yes.
And Rod's viewpoint, of course, was extraordinarily, his themes don't, I think the amazing thing about Rod Serling, and I like to talk about Rod as a great American writer, not just as a great genre writer, because I think that's selling him short.
Yes.
I think 100 years from now, Rod's going to be recognized as one of the great American writers. I think it's going to take about 100 years for the Academy to catch up to him. Because he wrote for television, strike one. He wrote genre stuff, strike two. And he was a 14-carat celebrity who did commercials, strike three. You're not Norman Mailer, out of here. But when all of that's wiped out, they will, as they caught up to Dickens, as they caught up to Twain, who were not considered the most acceptable writers of their day.
Right.
Those people would look at Dickens and say, you're not really suggesting that Dickens is the equal of Thackeray, are you? Well, who reads Thackeray today, except people in the Academy? But who reads Dickens? Who's been influenced by Dickens? Yeah. That's going to be Rod Serling 100 years from now.
And it's interesting that when you're talking about Carl Reiner, that both Carl Reiner and Rod learned their craft during the 50s, during the age of live television.
Right.
And I think that was very, very important. And Anne, when you were talking about how young your dad was, I mean, we realized that Rod, basically was writing all those scripts for, the golden age of television. And then in Twilight Zone, he was in his 20s and early 30s. I mean, he was a youngster, really, and phenomenal. And another thing, when you were talking about the misjudging of your dad. First of all, as we all agree, he was not this terrible, tragic figure sitting crying at home and and moaning over the 1950s and saying, "Oh God, I wish I were writing for Playhouse 90 again." That was not the kind of guy he was at all. But also the other thing that people often misunderstand, and I've said this often in interviews, is when he became a public persona, which he wasn't intending to be, he kind of became the host of Twilight Zone by default. When he became famous and was offered money for commercials and all of these things, he made that money. He liked being famous, certainly, but he was still a writer. At core, he was a writer. And every day he went into that office and rolled up his sleeves. And as he talked about, opening him up a vein and bleeding, onto the typewriter, that guy was swinging for the fences every single day. He never gave up who he was as a creative spirit and a creative artist. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, Anne.
Yeah, and in terms of the commercials, I know that he was a little tormented by his choice to do that. And I remember vividly conversations my parents would have about that. And it bothered him greatly that he would make, more money doing a 60-second commercial than he would, with hours of work into writing.
Right.
But yeah, he would get up at very early in the morning, have a cup of black coffee with sugar, and then his office originally was in the house downstairs, and then he built what you saw, Mark, outside the study. But he'd be out there for hours, and it's really stunning to me that he was able to, draft these scripts in 2 weeks, and the Twilight Zone pressure was pretty amazing for him and Matheson and Beaumont and Hamner and all of the writers, but to be able to produce that in such a short time is, as I'm struggling writing this novel for 200 years, I'm tremendously impressed.
Yes, and again, I think when we talk about all of we showrunners who admire Rod, if you look at David Chase with The Sopranos or Vince Gilligan with Breaking Bad or any of these shows, Ron Moore with Battlestar Galactica and Outlander and so forth, they're doing weekly shows where it's the same characters in the same setting. That's not nearly as hard as 1 week you're writing the After Hours and the next week you're writing, the Eye of the Beholder or something, So now I have my dogs going crazy. But that's, writing different scripts week after week is a phenomenal feat. And he wrote an astonishing amount of work. So, that was another aspect of it. So yeah, absolutely. And Mark, as a TV critic, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but
Well, another thing to point out is that, these writers who today, the writer producers, they also have writers' rooms. They have, 14 staff writers who are writing this. Even with the amount of work that Richard Matheson and Chuck Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson and Earl Hamner did on the show, how many of the 156 did Rod write?
Right. Many. Go for it.
90 something of the scripts Rod wrote. I mean, that's an amazing, when you consider that he was the executive producer, the showrunner, the host, the narrator.
He wrote 92 out of the 156 episodes.
There's nothing that compares to that.
No.
There's nothing in the history of television that compares to that amount of writing. And the amazing thing is, and this should give us all cheer, is that when I teach at Kent State University as an adjunct professor, and I find that there's only 2 black and white shows my kids know. Now, when I say know, I don't mean they just are aware of it. Yeah. I mean they know it.
Yes.
So the Honeymooners are gone. They don't know Ralph Cramden. They don't know. They don't have any idea. And I hate to say it, because this is going to be the first generation that's never lived in Mayberry. The Andy Griffith Show is quickly on its way out.
Yes.
But they know I Love Lucy, and they know the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
They still know the Ricardos, and they still know, and they don't know the Twilight Zone iconically. They know the Broken Glasses. They know the Gremlin on the Wing. They know the Cookbook. Because it's first off, it's still cool.
Yes.
Because it's still fantasy storytelling. It's still cool storytelling. And it's storytelling in a genre where people tend to go back and are aware.
Yes.
Of the roots. That's
And
not true with comedy. You can be into comedy today and not know who Laurel and Hardy are, or
yes,
the Marx Brothers.
yes, it's amazing. But
But if
I
you
think
say you're into horror and you've never seen a Twilight Zone episode, you're going to get drummed out of the room. You're going to be
right,
out of the conversation. It's like, well, go learn something, kid. You can't stay in the room if you don't know these things. You have
yes,
to know the old Universal horror films. You don't just get to stay in the conversation without that.
yes,
So
but
that's
also,
help.
yeah, but and so I didn't mean to interrupt, Mark, but
That's right.
also I think that there's a wonderful convergence between Serling as a storyteller and Serling as someone who has a lot to say about social issues and political and racial issues. I think that that's what allows you to watch those episodes over and over and over again, even when you know what the gag is, the capper at the end, is because you invest in these characters. Rod had such a great ability to write characters from a viewpoint of from being inside them and looking out through their eyes, the bank tellers and the shop girls and just average people. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, but he seemed to have such a great respect for just pretty much everybody.
Absolutely, and it's so interesting to me that, and I heard this from Julie Golden, my dad's old childhood friend that he grew up with, who recently died, another huge loss. But my dad's first dose of racism came when my father was in high school and he was blackballed from joining a fraternity because he was dating non-Jewish girls. So it's interesting that would come from his own people.
Yes.
And I think, was another thing that motivated him to, because he said, and I remember this as a kid, conversations that he would have with us at dinner about how racism just infuriated him, enraged him. And not to make this political right now, but in this day and age, he would just be apoplectic.
Yes, I know, obviously, yeah. And in that regard, there's this one of my favorite episodes of Twilight Zone also is the Big Tall Wish, because it has a major leading black cast, but it's not about race. It's about a man who's a fighter, and can he hold on to the magic, and the little boy who makes that big tall wish happen. And it's heartbreaking, and it's great because it's not just your standard racial bigotry story. It's a human story. And Rod, certainly, yes. I mean, we're missing his voice in now. I mean, obviously, he would have a lot to say about Black Lives Matter and Trump. My God, you're right. He'd be apoplectic. No two ways about it. We're almost out of time. So I think what I want to do is have everyone talk about, if there's one thing, if you were talking to one person and you were trying to convince them to watch Twilight Zone, why they should watch it, what would you say? And why don't we start with you, Mark?
Well, I wouldn't start after having written an entire book about lessons. I would not start there because it didn't start there with me. I would start with, because I would do what Rod did. You remember that interview with Mike Wallace right before the Twilight Zone started, and Wallace, in his typical snarky way, said, "Well, you're doing this thing called the Twilight Zone. I guess you're done with serious writing now." And Rod basically says, "Yeah, I'm done with serious," because he can't give away the trick. He can't give away what he's about to do. And I wouldn't do that, because if you tell people this is good medicine, they're not going to. I would tell them the same thing, how my kids show up. And when I first started, because remember, like Reba, I started watching the Twilight Zone on WPIX when it started in reruns in the mid-60s. I grew up in New York, Reba. So as soon as you said that, my WPIX came up. And the thing is, what got me into the Twilight Zone was the spooky storytelling, the wonderful feeling at the end when the hair on the back of your neck went up, and those wonderful payoffs. And that's what got me hooked, and that's what still is there, is the initial hook. It's not until I got older that I kind of realized, oh, there's more going on here behind this. So I would just start with, if you're interested in just good storytelling, if you're interested in good spook out stuff and things like this, go to the Twilight Zone. You're going to like it. You're going to like it. And by the time they're done, they're going to get the lessons.
Great. And Reba, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I would say that, but I'd also say, if you want an example of what television at its best is, watch the Twilight Zone, because you can't get any better than that. It is classic television. There are multiple layers. What you think it's about at the beginning is not what it's about. And even at the end, it's often not even about that. So just a prime example of platinum television. is the Twilight Zone.
And what would you like to say?
Well, those are tough facts to follow. You both said it so beautifully, but I know that my dad told a writing class that he had a propensity to write about the past. And I think some of his strongest writing are those episodes like Walking Distance, they're tearing down Tim Riley's Bar, The Night Gallery, that anyone can relate to. You know, that ability to see your parents and those touchstones of your childhood are just beautiful. And again, what anybody could relate to.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what I'd like to say is, first of all, I would say to them, watch all the episodes, read all of our books. Your life will be changed. You will never be the same. And I just wanted to thank you specifically, Anne, and thank your dad, because my life has been has been so blessed by the work your dad did and by the kindness your family extended to me. And I'm so glad that I was there at the right time to create what's come from that. And I'm so glad that we have home video now where everyone can watch the Twilight Zone whenever they want to. And it is just it's like, you know, the Mona Lisa. It's like Michelangelo's statue of David or Pietà. It is just the best we can do when we come to it with genius and a good heart, you know. So I'm very blessed to have been part of this journey along with all of us. So we've come to the end of our little panel today. I could certainly keep talking forever on this, and but we will definitely see each other another time, and stay well, stay safe, and thanks for being part of this.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.